Hello there, good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever and whenever you are watching this. I'm Martin Cross, this is Crossy's Corner, and with me we have Rob Treharne Jones, and we're going to do all things rowing commentary. Hi, Rob.
Crossy, hi, how you doing?
Yeah, excellent. So it's great to talk to you. I just wonder, I thought we might open, as it's not too long since the boat race, what your take on this year's boat race was.
They were both fantastic races, weren't they?
Yeah.
In their different ways, and such challenging conditions. I mean, when was the last time we had a northerly wind like that? And I suppose the big surprise for me was that neither crew that won the toss actually chose the Middlesex station. Otherwise, we might have seen a completely different state of affairs. Uh, from the pre-race form, I always had the Cambridge women down as the favourites, but I mean, there's been so much written and said about the men's race, hasn't there? And what an inspired choice it was for Jasper to turn sharp right, much as Oxford did way back in the mutiny year, although not quite as early in the race, because on that occasion, I think as soon as the man said go, they tucked themselves under the Fulham wall and got the advantage there, wasn't it? But yeah, once Cambridge had taken that half-length lead, and it's interesting. What could Oxford have done? I mean, obviously they were working off the back foot, but what could they have done to try and redeem themselves after that killer move?
Yeah, I think the only thing, in hindsight is go for the bump.
Yeah. And they gave it some, didn't they?
Yeah.
And in much the same way, I was commentating on the lightweights a few days previously. The lightweights took place on the Monday before boat race day, and the Oxford men's crew on that occasion went for the bump, but they expended far too much energy. They threw everything at it, and then they had nothing left for the next 4 miles. So the Cambridge men just went away on that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been interesting because I know it's been a big weekend of rowing, lots of things going on. I was quite struck by in New Zealand, the junior eights was won in 5:42, which was the closest margin ever in the Maori Cup race. And then a bit about the San Diego Crew Classic.
Yeah, I mean, Brooke sent over their I don't know if it was their leading men's and women's crews, but they competed in both divisions. I think what was it? The men were second and the women were fourth. But of course, we see, don't we, so many really good student athletes. They go over there on sports scholarships to the States. And there was at least one Brit in the winning Texas crew in the women's race, which was Miss Cassidy, Siobhan's daughter. So there's much rejoicing in the Cassidy household this week.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And I think they had Cal, who won the men over in the Crew Classic, had Di Mauro, that massive Italian sculler who was in Tokyo.
Yeah,
wasn't in the World Championships last year.
Now, was he the same? Was he the same guy that wore the hat that Crackers was having a go at?
The hat.
Yeah, sort of pork pie hat, wasn't it? And of course, he'd only got that place in the single because wasn't Simone Venier supposed to be in the single, and he got called up into the quad because I think a member of that crew had to pull out for whatever reason. So they had to reshuffle their scullers a bit. I can't remember the detail now.
Looking forward to seeing him at this year's World Championships. Then the Australians were in action. It was their championship. I think the Kings and Queens Cup were decided. And then we've had Pierluco with a sort of reasonably decent entry, actually. I wonder how that's going to affect this season's first World Cup, because the Dutch were in Pierluco, the Italians, obviously. I think the Greeks were, the Lithuanians were, the Romanians were, the Irish were. And
I suppose that's Antonio's influence, taking them to an Italian regatta, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. you know, I guess there were a few interesting results. The Dutch, as you would have thought, came out winning. I think the Italians were top nation, but the Dutch seemed to have a quite good go at most things. Lodo and Vicino were back in the Italian pair, winning again. Although I think they'll need to win by more to be convincing on the world stage.
But as you rightly say, it's going to make it, it's a bit of a forerunner of the World Cup series. But I don't know, the World Cup series, there aren't many squads, are there, who can afford to enter all three of the World Cups. And you've got the Europeans to consider at Bled, stuck in there between World Cups 1 and 2. So people really do pick and choose which they enter. And World Cup 1 these days is generally a pretty thin sort of entry, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's in Zagreb. So, you know, obviously the Sinkovic brothers are going to be there. But again, like, I'm not sure the Dutch will be there if they've gone to Pierre de Luca. I don't know, you know, because they'll be at the Europeans. It's interesting how it, you know, what sort of entries will be in World Cup 1. But Rob, we're here to talk about commentary and rowing commentary. I just wonder, you know, how long you've been in rowing commentary for and when you first got into it.
Well, I've been in so long, I've commentated on many of your races, Crossy.
Oh, not that long.
Yeah. I first commentated on a rowing race internationally in 1981. Because it came about because I was working as a junior hospital doctor. I got a letter out of the blue inviting me to join the newly formed exec of, you must remember NIR, Nottinghamshire International Regatta, which was initially sponsored by Guinness and some other big names. And then when their sponsorship ceased, then the whole thing sort of lost its way because there were no replacements to pour in some money. And the whole thing sort of wandered about a bit. And then the ARA took over direct control and put a new exec in place, including me. And I was in charge of press and publicity. And that included commentary. Oh. And the guy I'd asked to do it, who was himself an experienced commentator, and he said yes, he'd do it. And then I called him a fortnight before and said, I haven't heard anything from you. How's it going? And he said, oh, didn't you get my message? Well, as I now know, there was no message. He'd been spending his life letting people down left, right, and centre. But it left me in a quandary. But I'd done all the pre-publicity by then. I'd got all the right guys in charge of the press facilities and everything. So during the actual regatta, in theory, I was going to be at a loose end. So I solved the problem by getting into my own car with a start list and a radio pack and commentated on the race myself. So my first commentary experience was on a 2,000 meter 6-lane international regatta, which is not a step I would recommend for any novice commentators in the 21st century. But yeah, that's the way it happened.
How did it go?
Well, it went so well that the guys said to me during the lunch break, they said, hey, Robert, that seemed to go pretty well. Why don't we do that again this afternoon? And by the way, we'll find you a driver, so you don't have to look down the Port Road, as well as out the window at the cruise. And I was quite grateful for that because there were a couple of near misses. But and then in those days, of course, being a fully fledged FISA, as we called it, FISA international event, the gold standard was to do the commentary in French and German as well as English. So I taught myself how to all the rowing terms in French and German, and developed a pattern of jumping between the three languages during 2,000 meters.
Yeah, because would it have been a while before? I guess most of your commentary then would have been on UK events as opposed to international events.
It was like that throughout the 80s. So in fact, the only internationals I did throughout the 80s were UK-based events, mainly at home Pierpont, including the Worlds in 86 when I led the commentary team then. But then come the 1990s, and that changed a bit because I was called up to do the Eurosport commentary from from the studio in Paris. So I did that for Indianapolis in '94, where you were racing.
Oh yeah,
and
with Goldstrom.
That's right. Well, no, Goldstrom wasn't available, which is why they pulled me in. So I did that for a couple of years, and then Goldstrom came back. He was working on another project or something. So I did Tampere '95 as well. But I wasn't your last international year '94, was it?
Yeah, it was. Well,
Yeah,
remember. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And at the same time, 1990, I got the call up from the BBC to do the Radio 5 boat race commentary, which I did for many years.
How did they do that? Because that was actually out in the launch, wasn't it? Following the race.
Yeah. Well, the radio commentary was the first to go afloat, of course, because TV hadn't really been invented. I wasn't around then. Just don't get me wrong. I'm not that old. I'm getting on, but I'm not that old. So we would have a launch kitted out with a whole, the amount of hardware on board was ridiculous compared with the way of doing things today. And there would be three guys on board, typically, the anchor and two pundits. And we used to invite guests along. Typically one from each university, so it was quite a gang. I was also one of the timekeepers there, which was one of the reasons I got the gig. It was a great day out and a really friendly bunch. And I didn't what was it? 89 was my first year, but they stuck me on a bank as a trial before I was allowed in the launch 1990. So 89 was Brian Johnston's last year. Do you remember Johnners?
Johnners, yeah.
Yeah. And we only did one boat race together. And obviously I didn't overlap with John Snagg, but I met him on several occasions. And he was a grand old fella because, of course, the name of John Snagg is absolutely synonymous with radio commentary on the boat race.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess by now, Rob, you're picking up some lessons, hints and tips on commentary, from being with people. You've learned quite a lot. I mean, what were some of those learnings that you were picking up?
I think the big thing for me, because as you know, I now train new commentators. There's no career pathway for a rowing commentator. We all do it as a sideline along with our main job. Nobody can pay the mortgage doing rowing commentary. The standard pathway into going into this business is, to qualify as a journalist and then do sport commentary, and by definition that includes football as a first step. But if you've got no interest in football, then you're stymied at the first hurdle. So the sorts of things that I've used to good effect over the days: number one, try and get to know the athletes, because they're all personalities. They've all got their own individual stories, and then you can try and bring some of that into your output. So it's not just some sort of leaden stats about who's in the lead and by how much and what their strike rate is.
Yeah.
And the other thing is to give the whole thing some structure. So to lay out your stall, if you like. So you talk about different things off the start and through the first 250, to what you talk about in the middle of the race, to what you talk about in the last 500. And because it's radio commentary, then the ability to describe the scene and try and give the listener the idea that they're there, they can visualize it, they're with you in the boat, or these days in the car, because quite often at internationals I'm not out on the course. I'm being driven up and down the course in air-conditioned comfort, being able to stick my head out the window and talk about the race in front of me. So when I'm teaching people about commentary, I mean, they're all knowledgeable rowing people, so they know the sport, which is the prerequisite. Because if you start talking about teams rather than crews, if you talk about the referee rather than the umpire, if you start getting the names of the bits of the boat wrong, then people can see straight through you, can't they? So we can all talk about rowing, but it's doing it in a way that I mean, my maxim is inform, enhance, entertain. So tell people what's going on, enhance what they can pick up with their five senses, what they can see, hear, touch, etc., and do it all in an entertaining way, hopefully. And
Yeah.
yeah, so
So when was your first Olympic commentary, Rob?
first Olympics was Beijing 2008.
On the course.
Sorry?
On the course.
Yeah, on the Henley course, and that was challenging because the guys that I was working with, because at world rowing level, whether it's an Olympics or a World Championships or another international event, the rules nowadays say yes, it's multilingual, but you have the English plus the local language, and if the local language is English, as it was at Carapiro in 2010. They just let us get on with it. They said, look, you guys know what's what, so you can talk without interruption, which was great because we had 6 minutes to ourselves to be able to develop stories through our output without jumping back and forth across the two languages. So in Beijing, they said, hey, we've got a problem because the local guys that we've recruited, they know nothing about rowing. They're all football commentators. So they flew me out a couple of weeks early to teach them about rowing and to teach them about rowing commentary.
Oh, really?
Which was great in theory, except that I didn't speak Mandarin and they didn't speak English. So we had to rely on an interpreter to tell each other what the other ones had just said. So you can't really do a meaningful audition because there is no way the interpreter is going to keep pace with what they've just said. And in any case, we knew jolly well, I could tell from his demeanor that he'd sort of précis down what the previous person had just said. So it was, a challenging time.
How did you interplay between the two commentaries during the race?
As a general rule, you see, we, again, the rules that we've developed over the years, that every race starts and finishes in English. And generally speaking, we swap languages about every 250. And so there is because generally speaking, we don't speak each other's languages, there is very little chance for dialogue between the two of us. We're telling our own separate stories in our respective languages. But I know very well, because I've heard a lot of the guys speak in some of the languages I do vaguely understand. And quite a lot of the novices, because generally speaking, the local commentators are members of the rowing fraternity in that country who've stuck their hand up to give it a whirl. And they say they learn a lot from working with us. And they start off by translating what we've just said in English as part of their local language output. And then as they get more confident and more fluid about what they're saying and the way they're saying it, then they can develop their own little nuances and develop their own style, which of course is great to see them develop. And there are some venues I go back to time and time again. Lucerne. Well, maybe that's not a good example. Poznan is certainly a good example. So I work with the similar team of guys every time I go back there, and they're getting more and more confident in what they do.
Was it how big a deal was it for you to get to the Olympics to do commentary?
Oh, a massive deal, because I've been in this game a long while, and I was working, as some listeners may know, in my formative career, I'm a doctor. I was working as a GP in the west of England, and I had very good relationship with the regional TV down there, because I was the publicity guy for West of England rowing, and I was feeding all the local media sort of previews and reports from events that took place every weekend. And his name was Pete, the guy in charge of sport at regional ITV, and he said, one day you will be commentating at the Olympics. And he said that in the early 1990s, and I said, nah, well, I think that's right, Barcelona was coming up, and I couldn't get to Barcelona. And he said, no, one day you will be there. And I said, no, there's no way. And he said, yeah, I'll bet you 20 quid you will be there. And I wrote him an email when I came home from Beijing, and I said, if the bet's still on, you owe me 20 quid. And he coughed up and he said, well done, you.
So you've been to every Olympics since Beijing?
Yeah. Beijing, London, Rio, and of course the postponed Tokyo.
Yeah. What was your favourite out of all of those?
It was London, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, really. I mean, obviously, it's home territory, but what a difference, wasn't it? I mean, I remember walking into because Eton Dorney was sealed off, wasn't it? Why they did the installation, and then I was able to go in the first time once it had all been prepped up for the event. And I thought, what on earth have they done? I do not recognize this place. This is glorious. Just look at these facilities. Just look at what they've done. But I suppose if you throw money at an event, that's what you can do, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it really was fantastic. And as many people have fessed up to, the sound that 35,000 people can make in the last 500 meters of a 6-lane rowing race. I mean, that was unequaled at any venue I've ever commentated. And I've been to a few venues, as you yourself have done. I've commentated on certainly 4 of the 5 continents of the world, and the Dorney Roar, as we called it, didn't we? It was just absolutely unbeatable. And even sitting up at the start, when Rob Curling, our good friend Rob Curling, he was working in the tower on that occasion, and on my cans I could hear him doing the roll call, the announcement. But so because it was 2,000 meters away, the obviously the local crowd there was a roar when they shouted when they announced the GB crew, but because of the distance, we only heard the roar at the start when the next crew was being announced. So it was quite sort of incongruous. So it's I could have said anything I wanted to in the last certainly in the last 250 meters of that course. I suspect I was inaudible to the people in the stands at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting, Rob. Have you got any commentator role models that have helped you in your career, or that you've listened to?
I do, and it's a really interesting question, because that's one of the early items that we ask the participants in our training course. We sort of say, look, you've been around, you've heard people, you've seen people, and you think, hey, they're good. I'd like to be like that. So each participant is invited to make a list, a long list, a short list, whatever, of the people whose work they admire, and then try to pick out the characteristics of exactly why they admire that person. It could be their knowledge, it could be their style, it could be their general demeanor. And then we sort of begin to tease that apart in a sort of plenary session. And we sort of come up with our own personal lists of how we're going to model any future work that we might do. So Peter Jones was a great role model for me.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Peter sadly died in 1990. I mean, we haven't mentioned this so far. He died on the boat race commentary launch.
No.
To all intents and purposes. He had a massive stroke. And of course, I'm a doctor, so I'm trying to do what I can for him without any equipment in the launch. And Dan Topolsky, who was the 3rd member of the team on that occasion, he's carrying on with the commentary, working off a little TV monitor in the bottom of the boat, because I knew that Peter needed medical attention. But you know what it's like on the Tideway on boat race day. The crowds are thick on both banks. There was no way that we could pull into the side to some steps, maybe at Hammersmith. I think was going to be the most likely opportunity. We were not going to be able to summon medical help to the riverbank at that point. So I made the decision that we would carry on following the race, because I knew that there were ambulances and expert medical help at the finish at Quintin. So we got Peter ashore, and they took him off to hospital, and sadly was officially declared dead a couple of days later. But Peter was a really a comprehensive commentator. He could turn his hand equally well to a state event, a big state funeral, for instance, as he could to an FA Cup final. And he handled them all particularly well. And after his memorial service, which was held at All Souls Church just outside the BBC in Langham Place, and a group of us were invited back to the director's office in the Beeb and given a glass of something. And somebody said, well, there goes one of the last great commentators, because of the way he could turn his hand to anything. He did not sort of actually fill a particular slot. And there was a lot more chat about what it took to be able to commentate at big state events, because there's no dress rehearsal. You've either got what it takes or you haven't. They decided to trial out a few people because they'd run out of people to do that sort of event. My name appeared on this list.
Oh, you're joking?
Yeah. So they trialed us out at different events. So I did the Festival of Remembrance at the Albert Hall, and I did the scariest commentary gig of my career. I did the 50th anniversary service for for El Alamein, the Battle of El Alamein, the 50th anniversary service in 1992. That was in Westminster Abbey. So the Queen and Prince Philip were there. In fact, the entire royal family, extended royal family, Charles and Diana, Andrew, Edward, Anne, Rommel's son was there, Monty's son was there. It was pretty overwhelming, and I did the commentary for Radio 4 on that occasion. And I came out afterwards a shattered wreck, because it drained me physically and mentally, as good commentary should. And this is something else that I teach the new guys. It's a dramatic performance. If you've given of your best, you should feel drained afterwards. But they sent me a recording of this service, and I couldn't bear to listen to it. I would start it and think, no, I sort of relived the agony, all my mistakes, so it's been sitting there on the shelf ever since. And then when the Queen died last September, while we were both out in Rachitse at the World Championships, wasn't it?
Yes.
And when I got home, well, no, it was her funeral was held while we were in Rachitse, but you take my point. So I'd before that happened, I thought, no, it's time to bite the bullet. I sent off the tape to have it digitized, and I picked it up when I got home, because we hadn't been able to watch the funeral in full on TV because we were busy commentating in the Czech Republic. Yeah, so I listened to the recording for the first time in more than 30 years, and I thought, actually, that wasn't bad. Because I'd forgotten the pain.
Commentators often say, or can say, they find trouble listening back to their voice.
Yeah. I can't stand listening to myself, and I can't stand watching myself, because I've done a few bits of TV and things, and no, it's so I rely on people telling me what they thought, and that usually that's positive. So I'm happy to live with that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you've commentated on some incredible races, and it would be good to sort of look about, maybe what races stand out and what you remember about your commentary to them.
Yeah. Well, why don't we go back to Beijing, I suppose, for starters. And the final of the men's fours in Beijing was, without doubt, one of my absolute all-time favourites, because you remember that the Australians were leading GB until about 250 to go. And I was thinking, this cannot happen. This is Jürgen's crew. Yeah. GB are going into this as red hot favourites, and they're about to be beaten. And then Hodgie in the stroke seat took the rate up to 45 in the Olympic final. And you know what happens in any club crew, if they take the rate up to 45 in the closing stages of the race, well, the work falls right off, doesn't it? But those guys, they just dug in. And I was talking to Steve Williams immediately afterwards in the interview Hot Zone, and he said, we discovered things about ourselves we didn't know existed. He said, I do not know where that came from, because the rate went up to 45. They all responded. And as we know, they cruised past the Australians to take yet another gold for GB in the 4-. It was absolutely fantastic.
Yeah. And of course, one of the races you must have commentated on was that single sculls race in Rio between Mahe and Demir.
Yes.
What do you remember doing the commentary on that race?
To be honest, I don't remember an awful lot. It's quite extraordinary. There are some races that stick in, and it's not. You might think, well, for goodness sake, they were within 100th of a second of each other on the line. Surely I must remember doing that one. But there are races stick in my memory for reasons other than the closeness of the race. So it might be incidents. It might be some other outside factor that makes it stick in my mind. One of the I don't know how you are with this, but at the end of a day's commentating, somebody might come up to me and say, "Hey, Robert, you were doing that race involving so and so and so and so. What do you think? What happened? Tell me about the race." And I'll say, "I'm sorry, haven't got a clue.
Got no idea." Yeah.
Have a look at the result sheet, because when I've done one race, the race went off fine. I download that race from my brain and I upload the details for the next race. So all the data plus my notes on that race. And then that's my sort of mental worksheet for those next 6 minutes. And that's going to happen in 10 minutes time. So I need to be prepped up and ready for that one. So it's, I suppose it's the chopping and changing. We don't have the luxury of being able to, some of the host broadcasters, if they only do, say, the finals at a major championships, they got half an hour between consecutive races because there are medal ceremonies in between. So they can, embed, analyze, pick up information and really recall details that will help them remember that degree for later discussion like this. I tell you, though, let's take it all the way back to 1986, because here's one of the advantages of doing what I do and being alongside the crews in a race. I can pick and choose which part of the race I'm talking about, and the real race may not be between first and second, particularly in qualifying races. So you always, don't you, have to keep an eye on, hey, this is a rep, how many crews are going through? Is it the first two? Is it the first three, or whatever? Otherwise, you end up calling the race incorrectly. But I remember it was the final of the men's eights in '86, and Australia were absolutely nowhere. But I could see them they'd had a poor start, and just gradually they used the whole 2K to work their way back through the field, knocking off one crew at a time. And John Boltby, our good friend, who was Director General of the Australian Institute of Sport, wasn't he, on one stage, I think?
Yeah.
And he's got a recording of that race because everybody else was commentating off tube, as we call it. So just being able to see that square. And because I could see what was happening out of shot, because I've got a view of the entire course from my car, and I could see what was just sort of moving in. Whereas to TV viewers, they got literally a completely different picture of the race.
Yeah, I guess you're talking about incidents. I mean, what are your memories of incidents then in races happening?
Well, what about the Kazakhstan sculler sinking twice in Rio? They were shocking conditions, weren't they? No, what amazed me about we used to get up, we used to arrive at the venue before dawn in Rio, and it was beautifully calm. And then dawn would come up, and we'd say, "Hey, this is looking good." And then the breeze would come in off the sea, and suddenly all bets were off because there were standing waves down the whole course. And I can't remember any other event at that level, certainly World Championships, where the racing blocks had to be moved around so dramatically to cater for the weather conditions.
Yeah,
It was very challenging for the organisers.
and of course it was quite challenging in Tokyo, wasn't it, where that Norwegian double flip? Were you on that race, or was that Camilla?
No, I was on that race. Yeah. And again, it's you've just reminded me of another crew that flipped the German junior girls quad in Rotterdam 2016, and that they'd been leading the race, and then there was a momentary lapse. And I suppose it's most dramatic in a quad, isn't it? Because you've got 8 blades in perfect synchrony. Because quad sculling, when it's done well, is an absolutely fantastic sight, and some people reckon it's better looking than an 8 in full flow. But it only takes a momentary lapse, and suddenly the whole thing goes pear-shaped, doesn't it? And somebody caught an absolute boat-stopping crab within the last 150 meters, from which there was absolutely no recovery. And it was, I really felt for those girls, because but as an athlete yourself at that level, you can't afford to let go, even though you're cruising to what appears to be an easy win. You've absolutely got to keep your mind on it every single step of the way, haven't you?
I mean, you've also worked with a lot of commentators, pundits, and things. And then who do you like working with? Who's good in your view?
One of the great things about the team that I work with at World Rowing, I mean, there's probably 8 or 9 of us in the rota, and the way we mark it down and our availability at the start of the season, and then the guys in Lausanne pick who they want to go to each event based on that availability. But whatever we're doing, whoever we're working with, it's such a fun crowd to be with, and that's one of the main pluses. And yourself, quite often we're staying we're staying together in the same hotel in this foreign country, and quite often we're staying in the same hotel as at least one team. And that's the great thing about rowing. There's not this sort of us and them situation that you get in some sports, where the officials and the teams are kept as far away as possible from each other, and the press is kept as far away as possible from both the previous groups. I've been privileged to work with a whole bunch of friendly and informative guys who want to share their wisdom and their perspective. Quite often these are guys who come into rowing for the first time. I suppose Rob Curling is a classic example there. He was the World Rowing Tower announcer for several years leading up to Rio. I think he did 5 or 6 years altogether. And that's an immensely experienced guy. He's done TV and radio. And he is just such a fun guy to be with. And one of the things that we work quite hard on, and it doesn't always happen because of the business about languages, it's trying to develop a dialogue between the 2 guys in the car may be tricky, but trying to develop a dialogue between tower and car during so the tower will announce the next race and then throw across to us in the car to do the race commentary, and we can actually set up quite a nice little bit of dialogue just to get the thing underway. And Rob is a past master at that. And now, of course, Peter O'Hanlon, that has been the tower announcer for World Rowing since through the last Olympic cycle, He's now picked up that mantle, and he has a particular style of his own. And Peter, when in his early days, he and I first worked together at the National Schools Regatta, he when he discovered that he was working alongside me, apparently he fessed up afterwards and said he was a bit worried because it was his first commentary gig. And at Nat Schools, what we do is we put two people in each car, and one drives and the other commentates. And then after half a dozen races, we swap. So yeah, I've been able to teach Pete a thing or two in the early part of his career. And like many enthusiastic commentators, he's really gone out there. He's knocked on doors with his skills, and that's what we recommend people do once they are trained up with one of our courses, to go and knock on the door of any old domestic regatta, because mainly these guys are crying out for somebody who feels confident and enthusiastic about picking up a microphone and telling the public what's going on at their event. And hopefully, by this means, we're sort of raising the standard, or helping to raise the standard of commentary throughout our sport.
What do you think of the BBC commentary? You know, on the Worlds and the boat race. Do you have views on that?
I very rarely listen to it, to be honest, because of course, typically I'm doing the live commentary at the event. And I don't have the time to be able to
listen back.
Listen back. Obviously, the guys who are doing that commentary are immensely experienced. They've all been doing it for a while. If I have one slight criticism, it's all around learning the guys' names, because, and I suppose it goes with the territory. If you're working for a host broadcaster from one nation, the Beeb in this case is obviously going to concentrate on the GB crews. But whereas if I'm working for World Rowing, I need to be all things to all people, and to give everybody a mention, no matter how well or not so well they're doing. And so standard stuff, I want to give everybody a name check, everybody in the field. I mean, without being silly, I'm not going to name everybody in every 8, but certainly in the singles, the pairs, and the doubles, I want to give a shout out to everybody that's taking part, rather than just refer to them by the nation, because I think that doesn't then give you the opportunity to talk about their pedigree, what they've done, their story in getting alongside to be part of this field of 6 boats that we're watching right now.
You talked about prep in terms of getting ready for commentary. I mean, what sort of resources do you have to prepare, and how much effort or time do you put into prep?
Well, luckily, I don't have to do as much as I used to do, because before there were things like databases that we're now able to work with. What I used to do was to develop my own spreadsheet of all the international athletes, and I would update it after every international event. And it was a huge spreadsheet. It had about 30,000 athletes in this one worksheet. And then when I got the entry list from the event, it was 2 or 3 days work to pull down the pedigrees for each of those athletes, for each of the crews, for each of the events within the regatta. And it was very time consuming. Whereas, as you know, now we have the ability to, the entries that Swiss Timing coordinate on behalf of World Rowing, they are automatically pull down the athlete pedigree into a raw spreadsheet, a CSV file. And then I'm able to, I've got a few utilities that I run on that data sheet. And essentially it gives me, and the team I'm working with at that event, it gives me a worksheet throughout that regatta, because I've got blow by blow by nation, by crew, by athlete, and reading across the grid, you can tell the story about to remind yourself how that crew was put together. So they brought the 2-man into that 4 out of the pair, and that's left, the other pair man with the sculler. I'm just making it up as I go along, but you can see the story, the way the story might happen. And so at the top of the day, before I climb into the car, it's just a matter of pulling out a few of the salient features that I want to talk about in each race, as well as the race itself, because of course the most important thing when you're commentating on a race is to stick your head out the window and tell people what's happening in the race, and any notes you make are simply an adjunct to that.
Yeah. Now, one of the commentaries you do is for Henley, and that's obviously completely different.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you adapt to it, and what do you think of that difference?
You're right, it's completely different. So what we're talking about, because again, there are 2 Henley commentaries, aren't there? There's the YouTube video commentary that you do, and then there's the formal announcements, because it's an announcement, isn't it? It's a formulaic announcement from the top of the floating stand in the steward's enclosure, so it's heard by those in stewards and at a few other key points down the course, by Remenham and Leander and things. And that's the way that the Henley commentary has been since loudspeakers and microphones were invented, virtually. And it's completely different. But again, I teach newcomers to the team on this. It's about developing a rhythm, and it's a completely different rhythm to the way in which you would commentate on a 6-lane 2,000 meter international, because you've got a guy next to you who's jotting down the who's in the lead by how much, what the stroke rates are, and then the intermediate times to barrier and Forley. So you've got this little worksheet that is gradually being developed, and all you have to do is literally read that out in a way that fits into the Henley formula. So a heat of the Princess Elizabeth Challenge Cup is now in progress between Eton College on the Buck Station and Radley College on the Berkshire Station. At the end of the island, Eton striking 36, lead Radley striking 35 by a canvas. At the quarter mile, and so it goes on.
Yeah.
But that only works for the first race of each of the block of 5 in each half-hour slot, because typically at Henley you've got at least 2 races on the course at once, and we can only start commentating on the next race once we've announced the result of the previous race. And so by that time, typically the next race is already approaching Remenham. So we've got to do a précis of the race so far from the notes in front of us, so that we're commentating live on the race by the time the crews reach the bottom end of the enclosures. And that can be quite challenging, particularly when you've got an 8 race coming up on a slow sculling race. The sculling race might have been the last of the 5 race block. So despite the fact there's then a 10-minute gap instead of the 5-minute gap, the 8th race behind it might still be coming up hard on them. And so we've announced the result of the sculling race, and the 8th race is already halfway past the open grandstand.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned about this commentary course. I gather it's you and Pete Hanlon that are involved in it, Rob.
It is.
Tell us a bit about this commentary course, how it started and what people can expect and how they can get involved.
We've been doing it for a few years now. We only do it once a year, and because I'm in charge of the commentary at Nat Schools at the last weekend in May, it means that we give the guys who come along and participate in we call it a theory course. It's not just pure dry theory. There's a lot of experiential stuff as well. And then we give the guys the chance to work alongside experienced commentators a few weeks later at Nat Schools. And then armed with those skills, then they can go along and knock on the door of the domestic events in in the way I suggested earlier. Pete and I hit upon this idea because it seemed like the right way forward, because there's no obvious career pathway. We've got so many enthusiastic guys who want to give it a whirl, and these might be relative, they might be simply members of a provincial club somewhere in the UK. They might themselves be a retired Olympic athlete. I've got several members of the current GB squad who are looking to ways in which they might transition after Paris next year. So I'm not necessarily saying they're going to be taking part in this next one coming up later this month, but I'm just indicating that there's a broad reach, and that broad reach is also geographic. So when we ran our last course, same time last year, we had guys dialing in from Queensland, Australia, from Johannesburg, from the west coast of Canada, and that's why we run it at this curious time, starting at noon and finishing at 6 p.m, so that if you get up early or if you go to bed late, you can join in on the hybrid course in real time. You don't have to be there in the room with us, although some choose to do that. And it's being run. We're hosting it at Leander because we've got a dedicated space where we can do that sort of thing. So half the guys will be online, and half the guys will be in the room. And it's a tried and tested model. We've been doing it for a few years, and the guys who've done it previously, they say really, really positive things about it. They thought they knew their sport, and that doesn't change. But if you like, I'm losing my. It's not often you get a commentator who's lost for words. Falling over myself now. They learn ways of structuring their output to make their efforts sound more informative, more entertaining, more heading to ways in which they could develop their own style. So one of the exercises that we do, and everybody has the chance to take part, they're all invited to close their eyes, apart from one volunteer who is shown a slide of an athlete in action, or one or more athletes, and they're asked to describe it, to paint a word picture of what they can see on the screen. And then when everybody else opens their eyes, they have to say to what extent what they see actually matches what they were imagining in their mind with the description they've just heard. And this was a trick that I picked up during our training for London 2012, because of course I was doing the Paralympics as well, and they gave us special training to make ourselves more aware of those in the crowd with disabilities, particularly those with reduced visual function. So we were asked to be quite particular about the ways in which we describe what was happening in the race, with an eye much more on the detail. You know, the crews are moving from right to left. The opposite you is the press stands and the medal podium, and describing the colours and the grassland surrounding the course, and all the rest of it. So you can see that with these various tricks, people get the chance to develop their own style. It's not simply a matter of holding up a microphone and talking into it. One of my favourite role models, because I as some of you might know, I sing as well as speak, and in fact I sing to keep my voice in trim for my speaking. My musical directors would much rather it was the other way around, I think. But anyway, one of my role models is a guy called Eric Whittaker, and he's quite the showman. He's a Canadian composer. He's a music director. He's a male model as well, but we'll leave that out of it, I think, for this argument. And one of his favorite quotes is that the terror of performing never goes away. What you learn to do is to feel comfortable feeling absolutely terrified. And so when you pick up a microphone for the first time, you still have that frisson of thinking, hey, what am I going to be saying and doing? How do I suppose it's like the start of a race in some respects, isn't it? On the you start to feel nervous, and it's a matter of learning how to use those nerves to good effect. And as you will know, you've had to learn how to use those nerves to enhance your sporting endeavors. And what we're teaching people is how to use those nerves to enhance their vocal output in an entertaining way. Because if you ever go into a commentary gig feeling flat and say, "Oh, here we go again," you'll underperform, and that's not in anybody's best interest.
I suppose one of the really good things about commentary in recent years has been the number of women coming in to pick up the mic.
Yeah.
You know, one thinks of people like Camilla Hadlands, for example. You know, a lot of women now at Henley come in to do the YouTube commentary.
Yeah, and Kat Holloway is another example. Okay, she's had other priorities in recent seasons, but she was the first woman commentator that we had joining the English language team at World Rowing. She was also one of the first to join the team on the floating stand at Henley. Yeah, it's a welcome enhancement, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, how do people get into, you know, the stuff at World Rowing, you know, at the international level? What sort of?
I don't know is the answer, because the number of people who come up to me and say, "Hey, how do I get to do the job you're doing? How do I get to the Olympics? How do I even get to a World Championships?" And I don't know the answer to that. All I can do, and that's what we aim to do on the course, is to teach people some of the skills that might put them in the best position to get the nod when the time comes. So there's no application paper you can write to Lausanne to say, "Hey, give me a chance." But bearing in mind the way in which new people are being brought on board, and World Rowing have been quite proactive about this, haven't they? Because that is how Camilla herself got in a couple of seasons ago, because they actually held an audition. People were invited to send in their audition tapes, and then the winning candidate, who in that case proved to be Camilla, got the chance to join the World Rowing team for the World Cup the first World Cup that season in Belgrade.
Belgrade, yeah.
And and then goodness me, her rise to prominence has been absolutely fantastic, hasn't it? Because she was working with Peter and me in Tokyo just 2 years later.
Yeah, it has been amazing. And how long do you think you're going to be holding a microphone for, Rob?
I've announced I'm going to step down from international commentary after Paris.
Oh, really?
I don't even know. Yeah, I don't even know if I'm going to get the gig for Paris, but it would be nice. You know, I'll have done 5 Olympics then, just like Steve has, but obviously with slightly different results. Yeah, I'll carry on domestic commentary and hopefully teaching new guys as long as I can, because it's all about the legacy, isn't it? And it's great to see new people coming along with that degree of enthusiasm, wanting to to help publicize our sport in new and exciting ways. And the opportunities are all there. All we have to do is to give people the skills to allow them to develop that side of things.
Well, Rob, it's been great talking with you this last hour and sharing time. I know you've got lots of things to do this evening.
I have. I'm going off to bath my granddaughters now, so they're staying with us. I'm amazed they've kept quiet while we've been talking up here.
I know. What's the first gig you've got this season?
I've done my first gig. I was commentating on the lightweight boat races. What was it, a couple of weeks ago now? First international gig I've got is I'm doing the second World Cup in Varese.
In
So
Varese.
I'm looking forward to seeing, again, it's a venue I've been back to many times. Looking forward to seeing my Italian friends there.
Okay, magic. So we'll end the live part of this broadcast now, just to say thanks very much to special guest Robert Treharne Jones. Bye from me, Martin Cross, and see you again soon. Bye now.
Bye, everybody.